Here on our channel, people's stories come to life. Stories from different eras, professions, and destinies. Each of them follows their own path, their own life woven from circumstances, challenges, and choices. Before we step into their world, make sure to subscribe, and later, share your impressions in the comments. Now, let's begin. Some stories don't start with loud events. They start small, with details, with moments that seem insignificant, yet hold entire worlds within them. These are stories about people who never chose to be heroes. They simply lived, worked, made mistakes, learned from them, and kept moving forward. The lives of such people unfold like a slowly blooming flower, each petal revealing itself in its own time, each layer hiding new secrets, new pains, new joys. This is a story from a time when the world was just a little different. Morning in Lisbon drifts in like a pale ribbon of smoke. From the river, mist rolls through the crooked streets, coiling around tiled facades and wooden shutters that creak open one after another. The Tagus glimmers beyond the rooftops, heavy with the scent of salt, fish, and oil. The city wakes slowly. Boots scrape stone, shutters thunk, and gulls argue over refuse before the markets stir. On such mornings, a child often lingers near the harbor steps, hands hidden in patched sleeves, watching the sailors unroll their charts upon the dock's edge. His father works somewhere among them, stooping over barrels, his shoulders slick with sweat and salt. He never notices the boy's gaze, fixed not on the water, but on the papers, the twisting lines of continents, the coiling waves, the initials of ports spattered in ink. Those charts whisper of faraway lands, places more imagined than real. Each stroke of the pen feels like a secret, told only to those who dare listen. In evenings, when the scent of stew and tallow candles fills their narrow apartment, the boy draws on scraps of brown wrapping paper. Lines begin to form, crooked islands, rivers bending like veins, mountains rising as clusters of tiny triangles. His mother laughs, saying he will make better maps than the officers themselves. Her laughter warms the cramped room, even as she counts copper coins into a chipped bowl, saving for another week's rent. The family owns little. Their room leans beneath the slope of a street where washerwomen shout, and windowsills bloom with cracked terracotta pots. At night, the boy listens to the plucked strings of a guitar from the tavern below, its melody slipping through the cracks of the floor. He dreams of ships, not to sail them, but to draw their paths, lines so perfect they could hold the world still. One winter day, rain drives him under the shelter of a workshop door, where an old man smooths parchment across a table. The air inside smells of turpentine and dust. The man's steady hands glide over compass and quill like a kind of silent prayer. When he notices the boy watching, he lifts an eyebrow but says nothing. Days later, the boy returns, sweeping the floor without being asked. Eventually, the cartographer, Senor Duarte, accepts this quiet presence. He teaches him to wash brushes, grind pigments, and polish brass instruments until they gleam like tiny suns. The apprenticeship begins without ceremony. Every morning, the boy copies from crumbling atlases, tracing coastlines, learning the precision of ink as though handling the breath of gods. Duarte speaks little, sometimes only to remind, never rush the sea. It must breathe on its own. The boy nods each time, learning that patience is as vital as talent. Mistakes cost ink, and ink costs bread. Outside, Lisbon moves to its own rhythm. The call of peddlers, church bells striking noon, echoes of horses' hooves on cobbled roads. In the marketplace, people barter with gestures more than words. The boy watches as the ladies of better houses pass in carriages, their gloves spotless against the city's dust. He feels no envy, only distance. A quiet awareness of the invisible lines dividing one life from another, as clear as the borders he copies. Sometimes Duarte receives guests from the Navy, men in worn coats, heavy with salt, their faces burned by wind. They bring maps in quick need of repair, relics from voyages rumored to have circled the edge of the known world. The boy listens while pretending to clean the shelves. He hears words like currents, depth, coast of Guinea. Such names sound magical, carved from wind and rumor. Each evening, he imagines these places taking form beneath his candlelight, continents rising from darkness beneath his hand. Yet apprenticeships in Lisbon are not all wonder. Ink stains linger on fingers no matter how much lye they rub. The smell of fish seeps into clothing, and wages vanish quickly, traded for bread, oil, and rent. Still, there is purpose in the rhythm, tracing, measuring, copying, learning. In moments of solitude, when Duarte has gone home, the boy unfolds sheets discarded for inaccuracy and corrects them carefully, testing himself. He dreams not of leaving Lisbon, but of one day drawing its every street so faithfully that even its shadows would have shape. Years drift without counting. The boy becomes old enough to stand straighter, his speech more measured, his humor dry like Duarte's. He learns that teachers seldom offer praise, only nods that mean continue. He also learns to listen when silence lengthens too long. That is when Duarte, warmed by evening wine, begins to tell small truths. How maps can lie when asked by those in power. How a few strokes can change the worth of a harbor or the fate of a country. Such nights trouble the apprentice. He wonders if truth can ever belong to common folk like him, or whether it must be weighed, bought, and sold by rich men as they please. Those thoughts he buries deep, for questioning authority brings danger, and poor men survive best by knowing when to speak and when to bow. Yet sometimes, alone at the drafting table, he feels an ache, part curiosity, part unease, as if the world he copies hides another secret one beneath its ink. Time moves in circles, much like the compass he spins across parchment. Summer swells with heat, winter bites through wooden shutters. Lisbon sways between trade and hardship, but within the workshop, life remains stable, measured, and exact. The boy, no longer quite a boy, holds his pen with confidence now. Duarte allows him to sign his initials in faint letters at the corner of finished maps. The first time he does so, he feels both pride and fear, aware that every line he draws will outlast him, perhaps lost at sea, or remembered by someone he'll never meet. On Sundays, he walks to the docks, a loaf tucked beneath his arm, and sits watching ships depart. Some carry spices, others soldiers bound for foreign lands. The sailor's laughter drifts upward, carried by the same wind that fills their sails. He wonders about the edge of the world, whether those sailors might fall into the unknown, or if the unknown merely shifts to follow them, always one step farther. Lisbon's nights remain restless, smelling of wine, rain, and coal smoke. In alleyways, beggars sing songs of saints long forgotten. Above them, in his small rented room, the young apprentice reads borrowed scraps of maritime journals by the flicker of a tallow candle. The letters blur, yet he holds on to their shapes, translating their rhythm into the pulses of ink the next day. Years later, he will remember this time as quiet and undemanding, though it was far from easy. Hunger was a patient companion. Dreams were modest, a clean shirt, an unbroken pen nib, steady work, enough coins to pay rent without pleading. But in those humble desires, a seed of something larger took root, the sense that perhaps maps do not only record the world, but also reveal the cartographer's own passage through it. One evening, a storm breaks open across the Tagus. Wind rattles the shutters of Duarte's workshop, scattering loose parchment like frightened birds. The apprentice gathers them, presses them flat again, and sees one that bears his own trembling lines, a coastline still uncertain, jagged. He straightens it with deliberate care, weights it beneath a compass, and stands listening to the rain drum upon the roof. Candlelight gleams on wet ink, and for the first time he feels the faint certainty that every path, if traced with patience, eventually finds its shape. He smiles quietly, a flicker swift as a breath, and leans closer to the map. The rain outside eases into mist, and the city exhales again, calm and dreaming beneath the lamplight. Lisbon sleeps, as it always does, between hope and hardship. Within its stillness, a new cartographer begins to chart not only the land before him, but the course of his own becoming. The war had ended, or so people said, though its echoes still rattled Lisbon like a loose shutter. Soldiers limped home through the harbor streets, merchants muttered about tariffs and treaties, and rumors of uprisings reached the taverns before the morning bread did. Yet amid this noise, one man's days remained measured by quieter rhythms, the scratch of a quill, the hiss of ink upon parchment, and the patient ticking of an oil clock on the workshop wall. The apprentice had become a journeyman. His hands, once uncertain, now moved with confidence, guiding the compass and rule as if they had been part of him since birth. Years under Signor Duarte's eye had shaped him into something steady and exact. Still, the world outside seemed restless. Lisbon's hills, scarred by old earthquakes and new taxes, trembled with unseen tension. Yet here, among inkpots and vellum, there was order. The workshop near the Alfama quarter had changed little. The smell of wax, hemp, and ink still hung in the air, and sunlight fell through the dusty panes in slanted rays that made the motes dance. But Duarte, older and frailer now, worked fewer hours. The younger man often remained after dusk, continuing the commissions. Maps for trading houses, updated charts of the Atlantic routes, diagrams of property lines for a nobleman's estate outside the city walls. He bore himself with modest pride. The small wages were steady, enough for rent and bread, sometimes a mug of wine. He could sign his full name now at the bottom corner of each copy, though the signature was faint, almost invisible. That was his choice. Vanity felt dangerous for one of his standing. He had learned that those who rose too far above their means drew the jealousy of others and the attention of officials. Lisbon in those years felt like a city waking from a fever, half alive, half dazed. The Napoleonic armies had come and gone, leaving silence and suspicion behind. Prices soared. People whispered that the British advisors ruled more discreetly than soldiers had. The poor made do, stretching flour with beans, patching old coats with rope and buttons scavenged from market stalls. Masses filled the churches again, not from piety, but habit, asking the saints for work and mercy in equal measure. He kept to his trade, cautious and industrious. He had learned humor as a defense, a quiet smile to lighten tense moments with inspectors or boastful clients. Authority unnerved him, but he could mask it with a polite joke or bow. Yet among friends, apprentices, printers, and sailors, his guard fell. They met at the docks or taverns to share bread and wine, stories mingled with resignation. Lisbon's poor, it seemed, had always lived at the same tide, sometimes lifted by fortune, then dropped again into need. His room above the printmaker's shop was narrow but bright, a small table, 2 chairs, and a shelf holding a tin cup and a single ceramic plate. A folded sketch of the river rested above his bed, the first he had drawn entirely from memory. Some nights he traced its lines with a thumb, sensing how each bend of the Tagus carried both promise and sorrow. Around that time he met her, the bookseller's daughter. It happened on a mid-morning when a commission needed delivery. The shop, tucked along Rua do Carmo, smelled of old paper and dust warmed by sunlight. Shelves leaned beneath the weight of atlases, treatises, and novels translated from French and English. She stood behind the counter, her hair drawn back neatly, eyes bright with curiosity, as she noticed his ink-stained fingertips. "You draw maps," she said simply. He nodded, unsure if her tone was admiration or amusement. It turned out to be both. She spoke of books as one might of friends, some comforting, others dangerous. From her he heard of philosophers and travelers, of lands he had only traced but never seen. She seemed unafraid to question, yet never cruel in doing so. Her wit startled him at first, then steadied him. Their conversations grew slowly, like lines drawn over weeks rather than days. She spoke of reason, he of craft. Sometimes she lent him small pamphlets, ideas of liberty, science, the nature of truth. He did not always understand, but he admired their boldness. At night, returning to his room, he wondered if maps might be more than diagrams. Perhaps they were reflections of belief, of how one chose to see the world. Work filled his hours. He began receiving minor commissions on his own, copying coastal outlines for merchants unable to afford government contracts. Duarte, proud in his quiet way, offered fewer instructions and more silence. That silence was the closest thing to blessing the old man could give. The city's rhythm deepened. Processions wound through narrow streets, banners waving before candlelit shrines. Spring brought brief joy, oranges back in the markets, women singing in the courtyard wells. Then came the black clouds. The cholera outbreaks whispered about in the lower quarters. Fear crept like damp through stone walls. To ward off evil, women tied ribbons of blue cloth near doors, and priests sprinkled salt across thresholds. He, practical by trade, lit more candles than before. Habit or superstition, he did not care which. Through it all, he continued drawing. His reputation grew modestly. One evening, an officer from the port came to order a new chart of the southern routes. The officer's uniform gleamed. His boots smelled faintly of brandy. "Accuracy above beauty," the officer said. "Ships depend on these." After he left, the cartographer sat staring at the blank vellum. Accuracy above beauty. Perhaps true of maps, perhaps not of life. He thought of the bookseller's daughter, of her laughter slipping between the lines of debate. Life had its own mathematics, harder to measure, but no less precise. Months turned into seasons. The city began to heal. Taverns filled again. Children played near the fountain. Fishermen mended nets in open courtyards. He often found himself walking through Chiado after work, watching the changing light on the tiled facades. Some evenings the bookseller's daughter joined him. They spoke quietly, sharing small confidences, a story from her shop, a strange client from his. Their friendship seemed enough, though in silence he wished for more. One afternoon she asked, half teasing, whether he had ever considered leaving Lisbon. He shook his head. "The world comes to us," he said. "Ships bring its shape every day." She smiled at that, but something in her expression hinted at restlessness. For her, words were voyages. For him, maps were anchors. They both understood but never named the difference. The day he received his first payment under his own signature, he bought a new pen with a silver nib and a small loaf still warm from the baker's oven. He ate it slowly on the quay, watching ships prepare to depart. Around him, voices rose, ropes creaked, and the river shimmered as though the world beyond were just another chart waiting to unfold. For a brief moment he felt rich, not in coin, but in purpose. Years of practice had disciplined his hand, but not his wonder. He noticed details others ignored. How ink spread differently on humid days. How parchment curled when touched by breath. How even a tremor of laughter could alter a coastline's edge. To him, each map was alive, breathing the care of its maker. He sometimes thought that if one could look closely enough, one might read the maker's heart beneath the lines, the tremors of hope, regret, and devotion. Late one evening, as he cleaned the compass points, Duarte spoke without turning. "One must know the world to draw it," the old man said, voice thin as paper. "But knowing the world does not mean one must travel it." It sounded like parting advice, though neither said so. The younger man wanted to ask more, but the weight of unspoken gratitude held his tongue. When Duarte fell ill, the journeyman took over the contracts fully. The workshop grew quieter. Each commission now bore only his touch. The loneliness of responsibility surprised him. It was not freedom, but a heavier discipline. He realized, in all his dreams of mastery, he had never considered the silence it would bring. Yet amid that quiet grew a steadier sense of self. The boy who once copied from scraps had found his measure. His tools, carefully arranged, spoke of trust in repetition. His maps, folded and sealed, began to leave Lisbon in ships bound for ports he would never see. Somewhere across the sea, strangers would plan their routes by his hand, their lives depending upon his accuracy. The thought humbled him. As dusk spread across the city, he often climbed to the rooftop, watching the river darken until it mirrored the night sky. Lanterns flickered along the docks. The wind carried voices in half-heard fragments, laughter, prayer, the scrape of oars. The air smelled of promise, though of what kind he could not yet tell. Below, the city murmured, as always, shifting between shadow and light. Above, stars pierced the haze. Each shone like a marker on an endless, uncharted map. He stood quietly, tracing their pattern with his eyes, trying to imagine a path between them that led somewhere both far and familiar. Somewhere his heart could rest, not in conquest, not in wealth, but in the simple clarity of knowing one's own line upon the earth. Rain had a way of softening Lisbon's noise. It turned the market cries to murmurs, washed the dust from tiles, and made the cobblestones gleam like mirrors. On such mornings, the cartographer preferred to work by lamplight with shutters drawn. Ink flowed more obediently in damp weather, and the world outside, muted and gray, reminded him that maps were born from patience rather than haste. His workshop stood on a steep lane above the harbor, its door marked only by the scent of wax and varnish. A handful of apprentices worked nearby in other trades, but none stayed late as he did. He was no longer young, nor yet old. The years spent under Duarte's disciplined eye had shaped both hand and habit. The older man's death had left him the silent keeper of this space. His landlord grumbled about rent, his clients came irregularly, and still he refused to move. The walls held more than memory. They carried the faint trace of every map ever copied, every secret line ever drawn across paper meant to endure salt and storm. One afternoon, when clouds pressed low over the city, a sailor arrived. His coat was stiff with dried brine, and his voice, rasped by sea wind, revealed neither joy nor ease. He carried a rolled parchment bound in cracked leather. "It's an old thing," the man said, "found in the chest of a dead captain. The ink's faded bad, but they say you mend ghosts out of paper." There was a half grin, half warning in the words. The cartographer accepted the commission without question. He unrolled the chart after the sailor left. It depicted a section of Portugal's southern coast, Algarve by the outline, but the proportions were strange, as if drawn by a hand both skilled and hurried. Margins were covered with annotations, symbols, and faint letters. He recognized some as latitude markings, others as gibberish. Yet, one cluster of scratches near the rocky inlets caught his attention. They resembled neither coordinates nor tide marks, but deliberate, coded patterns, drawn faintly in red ink that had bled over time. He washed the quill, trimmed the lamp's wick, and began restoring what he could. The parchment, brittle from damp, yielded slowly. As the pigments revived under his careful brush, shapes emerged. A repetition of circles and tiny crosses hidden between the waves, barely perceptible. Such marks served no navigational purpose. Sailors drew warnings for reefs or currents, but this was something else, something intended for secrecy. For days he stared at the map between commissions, careful not to let curiosity outweigh duty. Still, unease crept in. The coded marks haunted him, pressing at the edge of thought like an unfinished line. He copied them onto a separate scrap, intending to show them to a librarian he knew from Duarte's days. The sailor returned a week later, just after dusk. His boots were wet, and his face carried the haggard calm of men who sleep neither at sea nor on land. He paid promptly, checked the restored portions, then lingered. "You read it?" he asked. The cartographer merely shook his head. "My task is to restore, not interpret." The sailor gave a curt nod and looked as if he might say more, but his breath faltered. "If anyone asks about this, you never saw me," he muttered, then vanished into the rain. That night there was commotion near the docks. By morning, news ran through the district. A man had drowned beneath the pier after midnight. The guards called it an accident, but those who'd seen the bruises on his jaw whispered otherwise. When the cartographer heard the name, he paused mid-stroke. It was the sailor. He locked the workshop earlier than usual that day. The coded marks felt heavier now, as if the parchment carried not information, but weight, a memory sealed within ink and salt. He folded his copy of the strange symbols and hid it inside a book about maritime surveys. Work brought distraction. Merchants still ordered property charts. Officials still demanded boundary maps. Yet whenever he drew coastlines, the faint crimson circles swam in his mind, each one a question without answer. Weeks passed before a new visitor came. This one wore fine gloves and a powdered wig, though one could tell by the frayed cuffs that polish had thinned over time. He introduced himself as a clerk acting for a noble family. "Certain documents concerning their maritime holdings have been misplaced," he said, his tone balanced between civility and command. "We are told a chart, an ancient one, was recently restored under your hand. We would like to see it." The cartographer replied evenly that the chart had been delivered and was no longer in his possession. The visitor watched him for a moment too long, then smiled. "Of course, we understand. Should it reappear, you are to inform us immediately. Prosperity favors the discreet." When he left, the workshop felt smaller, the air thick with oil smoke and caution. For the first time in years, the cartographer wished for company, not to confide, but simply to prove the world beyond his walls still followed ordinary rules. He thought of the bookseller's daughter, though months had passed since they'd last spoken. Their paths had parted quietly. Her father had fallen ill, and she managed the shop alone. He considered visiting, but hesitated. That night, unable to sleep, he unfolded the copy once more. The marks seemed almost familiar now, like a refrain overheard in a dream. He remembered something Duarte had once said, that every map tells two stories, the one its maker intended, and another it never meant to reveal. Some merchants altered coastlines to hide smuggling routes. Some explorers disguised failures behind heroic curves. But these symbols felt older, their secrecy less commercial than spiritual, perhaps ritual. He rubbed his temples. In Lisbon, superstition still fluttered behind reason's curtain. Sailors left coins beneath their masts for protection. Pregnant women avoided the sea wind. The cartographer himself, though schooled in measure and rule, had caught himself murmuring small prayers when storms rattled the shutters. Could a map carry a curse the way a mirror held light? Rain resumed outside, and with it a rhythm that suited thought. He worked through the night, tracing the symbols' spacing, comparing them to old nautical designs. By candle's edge, he realized the pattern matched the constellation of Orion, but inverted, mirrored along the horizon. Not stars plotted on sea, but sea plotted upon sky. It made no astronomic sense, yet the coincidence unsettled him. He wondered who might have drawn such a thing, and why. At dawn, he left the workshop for the river's edge. Market stalls were just opening, their canvas roofs dripping from the night storm. Fishermen argued over baskets of sardines. The smell of roasting chestnuts drifted from a corner brazier. The ordinary world carried on, blind to maps and mysteries. He envied it. Later that week, word spread that the authorities had searched several sailors' lodgings. A few were taken for questioning and never returned. The city's poorer quarters tightened in fear. Nighttime shutters closed earlier. The cartographer became cautious with visitors, burning scraps after use, storing commissions in sealed chests. Yet despite prudence, whispers followed. Of gold buried along forgotten shores, of captains who wrote in cipher to keep their route secret from crown and rival alike. One evening, a stranger lingered outside the workshop, pretending to study the street lamps. The cartographer watched from behind his curtain. Fear and curiosity wrestled quietly within him. He had once loved puzzles, but now the riddle seemed alive, peering back. When the stranger left, he barred the door and sat before his work table in silence. The pulse of the rain on the roof merged with the ticking clock. Everything depended on ordinary things, the steadiness of time, the strength of paper, the promise of daylight returning. He took a slow breath and wrote on the margin of his hidden copy, "Ink is only memory given shape, but whose memory?" Outside the wind shifted. Somewhere a bell tolled, its sound swallowed by mist. He extinguished the lamp, sat a moment longer, and listened as Lisbon settled into uneasy sleep. The smell of salt pressed through the cracks of the shutters, carrying both warning and familiarity. In that dark quiet, he sensed that the map had not truly come to him by chance. Something old had chosen the patient hands of a craftsman who believed only in lines and measure. And though he could not name it, he understood instinctively that the drowned sailor's secret had not sunk completely. It waited, folded, silent, watching him from the shadows of parchment, until he dared to unfold it again. Spring should have brought renewal, yet Lisbon wore a mood of caution. The air, though sweet with blooming jacaranda, seemed bruised by whispers. On the waterfront, men worked without laughter, their talk dissolving at the sight of uniforms. The cartographer watched from his window as rain-bent banners dried upon the harbor posts. The empire, still trading, still breathing, though thinner and older with every passing year. The map still haunted his table. Weeks had stretched into months, yet he never managed to rid himself of its ghostly presence. Though the original parchment had long vanished with the authorities' interference, his hidden copy remained. He had tried, twice, to burn it, but the thought pressed against his hand before the flame touched paper, a silent plea for preservation. It lay now beneath the false bottom of a drawer, flat among his older drafts. Work continued as always. Government surveys, naval charts, property lines for merchants who preferred discretion. But he noticed glances following him. Clerks who lingered too long near his drawings, messengers delivering unsigned letters that he immediately fed to the lamp. The coded marks from the sailor's map lived somewhere in the mind's corners, a low murmur he could neither silence nor translate. Sleep turned shallow. Sounds once comforting became suspect. He told himself that fear was a form of foolishness, a superstition no wiser than those sailors' charms. Still, one evening when a shadow appeared across his workshop wall, he froze mid-line. It was only a neighbor passing the window, but the tremor that followed told him his world of orderly measurements had tilted.
Once he might have sought counsel from Signor Duarte. The old master, were he alive, would have scolded him for indulgence. "Obsession dulls precision," he would say. Instead, an apprentice's caution had turned into a man's restraint. He worked, ate when memory reminded him, slept when the lamp gave out, and walked the same hill down to the market each morning. Routine, the most faithful companion left. Yet traces of the mystery crept in elsewhere. He began noticing unfamiliar men near the docks, too well-dressed for sailors, too certain of their idleness. One visited his shop, claiming to need a survey of a coastal estate near Setúbal. While discussing measurements, the man's eyes roamed toward the locked cabinet where maps lay folded. "You must see much in your work," he said casually. "Old coasts, forgotten markings." The cartographer answered only with a polite shrug. Caution had become his language. Lisbon bore a strange stillness that season. The clergy paraded relics through the streets, calling for divine protection from unseen harm. Some said it was plague again, others political unrest. But for the working people, fear carried no name. It arrived with footsteps in alleyways or the unmarked knock at the door. He found himself checking locks twice, then again before lowering the lamp. The bookseller's daughter came by one morning, bringing thin paper and boiled ink for purchase. Her appearance broke the web of isolation he had woven since the sailor's death. She looked older, though her expression still carried that calm curiosity he remembered. Seeing her among his scattered instruments and half-drawn coasts, he felt the years shrink, as if the cautious boy apprentice still watched her from the shop's corner. She examined his work with a kind of knowing restraint. "You've been busy," she said softly. He nodded, unable to speak of what filled his sleepless nights. "People talk," she continued, not accusing, but warning. "They say someone was killed for a drawing." He forced a smile. "Stories grow faster than vines in this city." Her gaze lingered a moment. "Even vines need roots." Then with a faint bow, she placed the stack of new parchment on the table. Payment was exchanged swiftly, but before she left, she added, almost as an afterthought, "Be careful what you keep." The phrase stayed with him. That night, candlelight trembled over maps layered one upon another. Lines of trade, routes of conquest, broken coasts, all tangled like the veins of a body. He traced them idly, thinking how men had spent centuries measuring the world, only to become prisoners of their own borders. Days turned into muted repetition. He completed charts for the naval office and delivered them by hand, taking longer routes home past the waterline where fishermen patched nets. One of them, an older man with scars on his arms, hailed him now and then, offering scraps of gossip. "There's talk again of treasure near the south coast," he said once, lowering his voice. "Old graves with stones marked strange. Sailors think it's cursed. Better to leave deep water to the Lord." Treasure. The word stung like salt on raw skin. He gave no answer. That night he dreamt of the drowned sailor's face surfacing through black water, lips moving without sound. One late afternoon he closed early and walked upriver, away from the harbor's noise.
The countryside beyond Lisbon spread in quiet patches of olive and dust, small shrines guarding crossroads, their paint faded by sun. He sought solitude but found instead a kind of clarity. The world, free from city sounds, seemed honest. Earth, sky, wind and grass. The unease that had clouded him softened, and he saw how little the secret really mattered to cosmic time. All men carried unfinished maps within. Most simply burned before completing them. Returning at dusk, he caught sight of someone slipping from his shop door.
The figure vanished down the alley too swiftly for recognition. Inside, nothing appeared disturbed, except the small brass compass lying open on the desk, its needle still trembling. Every chart remained, yet he sensed that eyes had touched them. That night, he moved the hidden copy of the sailor's cipher again, this time beneath a loose floorboard under his bed. The following morning, the clerk who had once sought him returned, his tone smoother, but his message colder. He asked again after a certain annotated coastal map of historic value. The cartographer replied with even calm that he knew of many such charts, but kept no private collections. The man smiled thinly. All knowledge serves someone. Choose your direction wisely. With that, he left, boots echoing faintly down the stair. Isolation deepened after that. Only work and silence remained loyal. He noticed how the city's light fell flatter through spring, dusted gold fading to pewter before evening bells. Yet within this dimness, something sharpened. He began to see pattern where before there had been only chance, the same men appearing near the quay, the same inquiries cloaked in politeness. The coded map was no longer a curiosity. It had become compass and curse alike. Weeks later, during a rare, clear afternoon, he visited Duarte's grave on the hillside beyond Grassa. The elder's name, half eroded from stone, seemed modest, almost temporary. He brought no flowers, only a folded drawing, his own sketch of Lisbon's harbor seen from above, signed quietly at the edge. Standing there, he spoke softly, not in prayer, but confession. "I cannot tell truth from caution anymore," he murmured. "Every line feels like a choice." Wind stirred the grass. Somewhere below, the bells of the convent rang vespers. He lingered until shadows grew long, then began the descent back toward the city. That evening, before night fully fell, he reopened the hidden map. The faint red marks, long faded, now struck him as cruel in their simplicity, mere circles on paper, yet men had drowned for them. He sat in silence, hearing Lisbon's muffled heartbeat through the shutters. The city, eternal yet changing, went on murmuring its secrets. From across the street came footsteps and a knock on a nearby door, followed by hushed voices. He pressed his back to the wall, pulse steadying by will alone. Minutes passed until silence reclaimed the lane. He understood then that his life had narrowed to two certainties, work and watchfulness. At dawn, he poured the last of his ink into a fresh bottle and wiped the table clean. Outside, the market awoke with clatter and warmth. Life persisted, dull and resilient, as if unaware of hidden codes or ghostly coastlines. He closed the workshop shutters halfway, allowing a thin stripe of sun across the floor. The light touched his compass, then retreated slowly, leaving the room in quiet balance. For now, the mystery slept again, folded among his maps, but its contours, like faint lines beneath parchment, remained, unseen, yet waiting, shaping the silence that followed him through each day. Winter settled over Lisbon like a tightening belt. The river's breath turned sharp, and smoke clung low above the rooftops. Bread grew smaller, firewood dearer, and words more cautious. The cartographer's days fell into a rhythm of quiet calculation, working by lamp until his eyes throbbed, then stepping into the cold to feel the world outside the parchment's borders. In his workshop, the memory of the ciphered map lingered. He no longer dared to study it, yet he could not let it go. That folded scrap beneath the floorboard felt heavier than any solid object, weightless to the hand, but immense in thought. The nobleman's clerk had not returned, though sometimes the cartographer fancied that the same thin-mouthed face stared back at him from a crowd or a carriage window. Such imaginings came unbidden, yet prudence demanded he believe them possible. Each morning, a faint frost lay across the shutters. As he prepared his ink, he caught himself listening to the city's muffled language, the clank of wheels, the creak of pulleys, the prayers of women rising from fog. Lisbon's noise was the heartbeat of survival, constant, roughened, and weary. Yet beneath it ran another rhythm, slower and more deliberate, a waiting pulse that only silence could reveal. He lived alone now, sharing neither conversation nor supper with anyone but his tired thoughts. Duarte's wisdom had faded into something like conscience, an inner voice testing each decision. If knowledge proves fatal, it seemed to ask, was ignorance not the better map? Days were work, nights uncertainty. Then came a sign to rouse the sleeping fear. A messenger's letter, bearing no seal, left beneath his door. On fine paper, written in blunt hand, were the words, "The shore keeps its dead below stone. The surveyors know their faces." Nothing more. He sought no answer. Letters carried risk, and questions invited reckoning. Yet the message gnawed, wedging under thought like grit in a shoe. That evening he walked through narrow alleys near Alfama, where the walls leaned close enough to breathe, the smell of roasted chestnuts mixed with smoke and salt. He followed the cobbles toward the waterfront, telling himself it was only to clear his mind. But reason dissolved as he reached the moorings. At the pier end sat a fisherman mending nets by lantern light. They exchanged brief nods, customary courtesy. Then the old man muttered, "You're the one with the papers." The cartographer stilled. "The drowned know where they lie," the fisherman added, eyes on the river. "But the living keep digging." When he looked again, the man had turned away, speaking softly to his net as if to a companion. The cartographer left without a word, the echo of the remark following him up the hill. Over the next days, whispers deepened around the docks. Some said graves had been unearthed near the southern coast, a series of shallow pits where stones bore cryptic carvings. Others swore the king's men had ordered silence, declaring the land cursed. Among the tradesmen, talk shifted quickly from rumor to fear. The cartographer tried to ignore it, but each mention of graves felt like a thread tugging loose from memory. In his workshop, drawers became shrines of secrecy. He hid his private copies within layers of newer charts, burying them under merchant commissions. He worked faster, as if motion itself might unmake the unease. Lines stretched across paper, coasts smooth as blades, islands sharp as teeth.
When exhaustion overtook him, he dreamed of parchment burning, of rivers turned black by ink and smoke. One morning, mid-February, he noticed the smell of char before he reached his street. A dozen neighbors stood outside his building, their faces pale in the morning mist.
At first he thought it was another's misfortune. Then he saw the drifting gray from his own windows. Inside, ruin. The shelves blackened, drawers warped, papers curling into fragments. The air tasted of metal and oil. The fire had eaten slow and deliberate, as though searching for something. Yet curiously, it spared the wall behind the table, the very panel concealing the hidden floorboard. The drawers that once held his official work were ransacked, but the one place holding the cipher's secret was untouched, as if the flames themselves had respected a boundary. He stood amid ash, neither angered nor broken. Instead, there came an odd calm, the kind that follows recognition. Something, or someone, had come seeking what he refused to surrender. They had taken all but that scrap of guarded mystery, leaving him poorer, but intact. Work could be rebuilt, maps could be redrawn, secrets, once learned, could not be erased. That evening he found her again, the bookseller's daughter. Her shop, narrower now without her father's voice, smelled of candle smoke and ink. When she saw him, her hands hesitated over a stack of ledgers. "I heard," she said simply. He nodded. Silence stretched, filled with the sound of rain striking the awning outside. Then she asked, "Do you still have it?" He met her gaze but did not answer. Perhaps silence itself served as confession. She sighed. "You look like someone searching too hard for an ending." "Perhaps a beginning," he said quietly. A faint smile touched her lips, kinder than pity. She guided him to the back room where an oil lamp burned low beside old maritime journals. Together they examined a book she'd kept hidden since her father's time, a record of naval trials, faded to near anonymity. Within its appendix lay a list of executions, names struck through, their crimes listed as mutiny and treachery. Among them, faint pencil marks traced a pattern, the same as the ciphered circles he knew too well. "It isn't treasure," she said, reading his thoughts before he spoke. "They buried them, each condemned sailor marked beneath stone. Whoever wrote that map wasn't chasing gold. He was keeping count." The revelation fell with unexpected relief. All those whispered deaths, the restless search by noblemen and spies, it was not greed that tied them together, but guilt. The map was memorial, not promise. Lines marking bodies, not riches. He felt shame rise in his throat, shame for his curiosity. For every moment he had turned mystery into ambition. He left the book with her, unwilling to risk its fate among his ashes. At the door she touched his sleeve. "Secrets can preserve truth," she said softly, "but they can also cage it." He walked home through the narrow lanes, past shuttered taverns and darkened altars. Snow, or what little the city ever saw of snow, fell as thin dust against his coat. In his pocket, the hidden scrap seemed lighter now, its mystery resolved into sorrow. Yet a residue of unease remained. If the truth was burial, who protected it? And from whom? Later that night, when he lit a small lamp amid his blackened workshop, he moved carefully through the remains. Among charred scraps, he found one corner of a burned commission bearing an unfamiliar seal, an emblem not from any known office, a pair of wings crossed by an anchor. Someone unseen had ordered this destruction. He sat on the half-intact stool, staring at the surviving compass coated in soot. Its point still quivered. Outside, wind rattled against the shutters, carrying the smell of coal fires from the hills. He thought of the graves along the southern coast, lying silent beneath those carved stones, while men above still played their endless games of power and silence. Taking a blunt quill, he began to draw again, not maps for clients, but lines resembling memory itself. He drew the shoreline of the mind, a thin coast where conscience met fear. The ink, thinned by ash, spread unevenly, like a tide disturbed. He did not correct it. Some errors deserved to remain. When morning came, he left his workshop open to the air for the first time since the fire. The city, indifferent yet alive, resumed its clatter. Cart wheels over stones, children's cries, church bells shaking sunlight onto the ruins. He stood at the doorway until warmth reached his face. Smoke still rose from broken timbers, twisting skyward like a question without end. The cipher's scrap, still hidden where flame had failed to find it, waited below the floorboards. He no longer feared it, but he did not free it either. Knowledge was best left between the lines, drawn faint enough that only time might read it whole. And as the day widened across the harbor, he felt a quiet acceptance settle upon him. The world itself was a vast, imperfect chart, haunted by erasures and half-truths, an endless map not of what was sought, but of what survived. He left Lisbon quietly, without farewell. The city had turned damp and narrow. Every street seemed to echo with the rustle of eyes. A coastal merchant bound for Faro offered passage in exchange for his skill at charting routes. He accepted without deliberation. A man who had watched his own workshop burn had few belongings left to anchor him. In the gray dawn, Lisbon shrank behind the ship's stern, its church towers rising through mist like guilt refusing absolution. The vessel was modest, a creaking cargo ship that smelled of oil and oranges. Its hold carried salt, cloth, and hopes of modest profit. The crew worked hard and swore by saints the Cartographer had never heard of. He slept near the bow, beside barrels sealed with wax, waking to the sway that felt almost breathing. Life at sea unfolded by rhythm, not clock. Work, eat, patch, rest. Days and nights merged into one rolling horizon, and the noise of Lisbon fell away until only thought remained. Maps filled his hands again, though of a simpler kind. Currents, distances, coastal depths, precise, functional work for men who measured survival by latitude. He found comfort in that constraint. There was honor, perhaps, in drawing lines that saved lives instead of concealing them. And yet sometimes, when the lantern light struck his page just so, he caught himself tracing the forbidden pattern again, the circles of the cipher, half memory, half muscle. He would smudge it before anyone noticed, though not before recalling the faces of the dead sailors whose stones bore those same marks. At ports, the merchant captain traded goods and stories alike. He boasted that his maps never failed him, unaware that the man who drew them preferred not to be known. The cartographer let him talk. He liked the simplicity of these new acquaintances, men guided only by wind and hunger, untroubled by the invisible games of cities. Still, distrust shadowed every kindness.
The lesson Lisbon had burned into him remained. Those who smile too easily often write the cruelest lines. One evening, moored near Setúbal, he befriended a sailor named Estevão, a man older than the sea should have allowed, scarred, weather-bitten, his laughter dry as salt. They shared bread and wine upon the sand, the air damp with kelp and tobacco smoke. Estevão spoke of storms and ghosts like ordinary things. "Every map is haunted," he said. "The sea remembers what it takes." The cartographer wanted to answer that memory was a burden, not a mercy, but stopped himself. The truth was, he envied the man's ease. In Estevão's company, the constant vigilance loosened. They worked together on minor commissions for the merchant fleet, drafting charts of harbors and depths. The sea rewarded them with steady wages and enough warmth to forget caution, if only briefly. Then, in the southern waters near Lagos, traces of the past resurfaced. During a routine survey, the cartographer noticed a section of coast whose ridges matched those etched into the drowned sailor's map. He hid his reaction behind calm habit, marking rocks and sandbanks while his mind raced. Later, alone on the deck, he compared the lines from memory. It was the same shore. The graves, if they existed still, lay not far inland, beneath centuries of tide and rumor. The realization drew no thrill, only resignation. Some secrets outlast the men who keep them. He had fled Lisbon, thinking distance might dull the map's pull, yet it had followed him as faithfully as shadow. That night he walked the strand under a half-moon, footprints sinking softly beside the tide's whisper. There was nothing to find. No stones carved, no signs of burial, only wind shifting the dunes as though erasing every trace of confession. He felt neither triumph nor loss, only weariness deeper than the sea's reach. In the following weeks, his work went on. Ships came and went, bearing their small cargoes and petty ambitions. He copied charts, weighed anchors, tasted wine gone sour from salt air. Still, faint rumors trickled through the sailors' talk. Others, seeking old graves, claiming treasure, vanishing days later without trace. Greed, like tide, never ceased its return. Estevão noticed his silence one evening as waves slapped gently against the hull. "You've the look of a man reading a map no one else can see," he said. The cartographer smiled faintly. "Perhaps I misdrew it." "Then draw another," the sailor offered, shrugging. "That's what we do, isn't it? When the wind changes, so must the course." Simple words, but they struck with quiet force. For years he had followed the same invisible line, curiosity, fear, guilt, until it had replaced all direction. He realized that maps, for all their certainty, could bind a man just as fast as they could free him. Months blurred into the slow comfort of repetition. The cartographer began sketching for pleasure again, small island shapes, fragments of imagined coastlines. He found in that act a strange calm, as though by inventing unknown lands he could lighten the weight of known ones. Estevão sometimes watched, shaking his head. "You're a fool to love what kills men," he would say, but the remark held no malice, only familiarity. One pale afternoon, a packet reached the port for him, a letter written in the careful hand of the bookseller's daughter. It carried few words, but one request. "Duarte is gone. He left something for you if you still wish to know. He left with the next tide." The journey north felt both longer and shorter than the miles suggested. Lisbon rose again from mist, older but unchanged. The streets seemed narrower, the people more hurried, the air heavier with smoke. Yet after months of brine and rocking decks, even this anxious city felt like ground reclaimed. He found her waiting in the bookshop, hair touched by gray at the temple, eyes still steady. From beneath the counter she drew a sealed envelope wrapped in cloth. Inside lay a folded page dated years before Duarte's death. The handwriting was spare, almost methodical. If you ever see the pattern again, follow its silence, not its promise. The truth lies where men refuse to look. No map enclosed, merely those words. Beneath them, however, a small drawing had been inked, an outline of the Tagus River meeting the sea, and at its margin a mark identical to the coded circle that had set all in motion. The cartographer stared a long while. This was no continuation of mystery, but a farewell from a man who had understood sooner. Duarte had known the cipher, perhaps even the execution it recorded, but left no explanation, only guidance that pointed inward rather than outward. He thanked her, voice unsteady. She said nothing more, reading silence as she had always read books. Before he left, she offered one final observation. "You always chased what was hidden," she said. "Perhaps now it will chase no longer." Outside, the evening light slanted gold through the narrow street. The city's noise, for years a threat, now blended into life's ordinary hum. He walked uphill to the ridge above São Vicente, where the river widened to meet the horizon. In the fading glare, many ships moved like small thoughts coming and going. He unrolled a blank sheet and began sketching without plan, drawing only what he saw, simple lines, honest and unguarded. Below him the tide turned. Boats that had seemed still began to drift again, following the current out toward the sea's indistinguishable gray. He imagined their wake, tracing invisible paths, as if the ocean itself were rewriting its own map. The idea brought a faint, quiet peace. When night arrived, he folded the parchment carefully and placed it into his satchel. It was clean of codes, free of secrets. For the first time in many winters, he felt content to leave an edge unmarked, a space unfinished. The world did not need mastering. It needed merely to be witnessed. Far below, the Tagus shimmered under moonlight, drawing breath into the city's walls. Somewhere in the deep, perhaps, those long-buried sailors rested, undisturbed, their story fading as storms and centuries passed. And above them, a man who had drawn half his life in pursuit of clarity stood watching the water, learning that sometimes understanding is only the acceptance of not knowing. He turned from the river then, walking slowly back through the lamplit streets that led once more toward home. The spring sunlight reached Lisbon unevenly that year, falling pale upon the rooftops and glittering off the harbor's unrest. Trade ships crowded the quays again, barrels rolled, horses strained, and the air thickened with the scent of salt, tar, and spices. Yet none of it seemed meant for him. He moved through the bustle as a man untethered, half returning, half not. The cartographer had outlasted grief and secrecy, yet some fragment of the past still whispered beneath his skin like a tide that refused to ebb. He had taken employment once more, this time with a small naval office that handled the surveying of estates and ports.
His reputation for silence preceded him, and silence, in turn, proved its own kind of recommendation. They gave him a desk near a window, paper measured by the sheet, and ink tallied by the ounce. It was work without intrigue, but also without threat, and that suited him. Still, the envelope Duarte had left, the one bearing the cryptic sketch of the Tagus with its single marked circle, pulled at him in quiet moments. He kept it tucked within the cover of a ledger, as though hiding it inside labor might soften its call. But every time his eyes drifted toward the river outside, the spot where that mark had been inked demanded consideration. It corresponded not to a harbor or fortress, but to a forgotten chapel standing half-buried beneath the old monastery at São Vicente. He told himself discovery was no longer his concern. The merchant's journeys had cured him of curiosity's fever. Yet there were questions that refused extinction, the kind not fed by wonder, but by responsibility. Duarte had trusted him with this final message, and to ignore it felt almost like betrayal. One evening, after dismissing his apprentice, he followed the slope toward the monastery. The alleys grew quieter as he climbed. Lisbon at twilight belonged to its own echoes. The chapel was there, indeed, flanked by overgrown cypress and a crumbling wall kissed by moss. Its door hung half-lifted from the hinges. Inside, the scent of dust and wax persisted, though no candles burned. He moved slowly through the dimness. Along the far wall, stone had fractured, as if time itself had exhaled a breath too heavy to bear. Between the cracks, a hollow glinted faintly. He knelt and brushed away debris, discovering a small cavity sealed by brick. From his coat, he drew the old compass, its brass worn dull, and tapped gently until the mortar loosened. The effort yielded a small wooden box, its lock long corroded. Inside lay a book no larger than a man's palm. The pages were stiff, stained with water, the ink barely legible. But what words survived were a revelation. Not coordinates or riddles this time, but confessions. It was a record kept by a naval clerk generations before Duarte, describing trials carried out in secrecy. The same trials that had condemned those sailors whose graves the cipher marked. The entries named the officials who had ordered the executions, none for mutiny, as the decrees had claimed, but for refusing to traffic in stolen gold from the colonies. Their silence had been their crime. He read through the dim hours, tracing each line as if excavating the bones of truth itself. The map, the cipher, Duarte's warning, all pointed here. And this, the so-called treasure, was merely proof, preserved by chance and grace. Not jewels or bullion, but names. By the time dawn crawled over the tiled rooftops, he sat upon the chapel step, the small diary resting on his knee. The weight of it was immense, though measured only in conscience. Something had to be done, though nothing heroic could come of it. He had learned the cost of righteousness before. It came wearing the same face as ruin. He returned to his workshop before others stirred the streets, sealing the diary in a leather folio. All day he worked steadily, completing coastal drafts and delivering them to the office as if nothing had changed. Yet by evening he walked toward a different district, to the home of a printer once known to Duarte, a man skilled in discretion. He left the folio anonymously in his care, with only a note, for the records of history, not for the gossip of men. No one came seeking him afterward. The document perhaps found its place quietly among archives where curiosity outweighed command. or perhaps it vanished into another box, awaiting some future rediscovery. The cartographer did not inquire. He was content to let knowledge find its own course, as rivers do when left unbridled. For a time, life steadied again, though its pattern had shifted. He worked, he taught his apprentice, he walked through morning fog to buy bread from the same corner vendor who never failed to ask about weather before price. The ordinary world resealed itself around him, but never quite the same. Something lighter occupied his chest, not victory exactly, but a sense of equilibrium at last. Weeks later, wandering through the Alfama at dusk, he paused by a group of sailors mending nets. Their talk drifted upward, threading with the sea breeze. Among them, no mention of treasure, no fear of curses lingered. Instead, they joked about storms and wages, about who owed whom a mug of wine. The superstition had faded, the ghost of greed dispersed. He smiled at the sound. For the first time in years, the harbor noise struck him as music, not menace. At home that evening, he lit a single candle and studied the compass resting upon his desk. It still trembled slightly, its needle never perfectly at north, as though reminding him that orientation was never absolute. He began drawing again, not from commission this time, but from memory. The curve of the Tagus at dawn, the pattern of tiled roofs from the Alfama Ridge, the gentle sprawl of countryside beyond. His lines came sweet and unhurried, filled not with calculation, but affection. In the following months, talk of an anonymous revelation began circling among scholars and scribes, a rediscovered record that challenged official accounts of maritime justice. He listened with quiet disinterest, neither confirming nor denying what he knew. Truth had left his hands. It no longer demanded guardianship, only peace. One afternoon, as spring tilted toward summer, the bookseller's daughter visited once more. Her hair pinned simple, her eyes softer than he remembered, she looked around the workshop filled with the new maps. "These aren't voyages," she said, touching the edge of a drawing. "They look like memories." "Perhaps they are," he replied. She hesitated, then smiled. "You seem lighter." He thought for a moment before answering. "The world feels clearer when its lines finally meet." They sat in the warmth for a time, speaking little. Outside, the sound of carts mingled with the cry of laundry on lines, the hum of ordinary life expanding in its own measure. When she left, he stood at the window watching sunlight spill over the ruined rooftops Duarte once described as the city's broken teeth. The city had indeed aged and chipped, yet it endured. So too, he thought, do people, patched and weathered, still tracing new paths upon familiar ground. That night, he worked by lamplight until the last draft was complete, a map unlike any he had drawn before, where each known coast faded deliberately into open white. No labels marked the edges, no false precision pretended to master what lay beyond. He allowed the emptiness to remain. When the lamp finally burned low, he set down his pen and studied the work in silence. It was not perfection he saw, but balance, the world as shifting truth, no longer something to conquer or conceal. The river outside murmured as tide met stone, the sound of an old language known only to those who listened long enough. He closed the shutters, left the lamp sputtering, and sat a while until darkness folded comfortably around him. Somewhere beyond the walls, a bell announced midnight. The city breathed in unison. And for the first time in decades, the cartographer's heart moved quietly with it, neither resisting nor longing, only aligned, like a compass point finally at rest. The mornings had grown quieter with the years. Lisbon still rose with its usual restlessness, the cry of merchants, the clatter of horseshoe and wheel, but these sounds reached him now as though softened by distance. He had moved from his old quarters near the harbor to a modest room above a carpenter's shop, where the scent of pine shavings mingled with coffee from the stall below. From this height, he could see the rooftops descending toward the river, and beyond them, the silver curve of the Tagus exhaling mist. He no longer worked for the naval office. The commissions had grown dull, the bureaucracy heavier, and his hands had begun to tire after long hours. Instead, he taught a small group of apprentices, 3 eager boys of differing temperaments, but one shared curiosity. They came each morning with rough fingers and wide eyes, bringing stories from the streets and questions about everything from magnets to meridians. Watching them bent over their compasses, he sometimes glimpsed his younger self, a boy tracing imaginary coasts, unknowingly drawing the borders of his own longing. The workshop they shared was smaller than Duarte's had been, but sunlit, the walls lined with shelves of instruments and inks in glass jars. Sometimes when rain tightened the sky, he felt Duarte close again, the soft cough, the muttered correction, the quiet satisfaction when a line curved true. Those memories came now without sorrow. Age, he realized, did not erase wounds. It simply taught them to breathe alongside the living. He kept few possessions, simple furniture, a kettle, a stack of papers tied with twine, and, upon a single shelf, the compass that had outlasted the decades. Its needle still shivered, restless even in still air. Next to it lay a folded sheet that he had never finished, the map he began after finding the diary in the chapel, the one that faded deliberately into blankness. He thought of it not as failure, but as invitation. Whenever he taught his students, he pointed to that emptiness as a lesson. Every chart must end, he said. What lies beyond belongs to imagination, not to error. Lisbon itself had changed in rhythm, if not in soul. The wars were distant now, the streets cleaner, the mood lighter. Ships from Brazil returned laden with goods and rumors of fortunes. Merchants whistled again. Yet beneath the air of renewal remained the same quiet inequality he had known in youth. He saw it in the calloused faces that unloaded barrels along the docks, the sons of men who had once carried the same burdens. He marked it, too, in the noblemen's gardens rising anew on hillsides, their fresh white walls catching the sun, while alleyways below them remained cracked and narrow. The map of the city seemed eternal, small lives crowded between the grand spaces of the powerful. He worked slowly now, not for gold or title, but for rhythm. Ink still flowed like thought, patient and measured, though his hands shook slightly when the morning chill lingered. He found that mistakes no longer frightened him. A spilled drop of pigment became part of the design. A change in curvature often improved balance. In craft, as in life, he had learned to meet imperfection with gentle adjustment rather than refusal. At times he walked the waterfront at dusk, where gulls drifted low and children skipped stones. The world seemed both larger and kinder in twilight. Nearby, wine cellars gathered by the piers, their lamps glowing like small, anchored suns. He shared their company now and then, drinking slowly, listening more than speaking. They knew him by sight, the quiet mapmaker who laughed seldom but sincerely, who fixed the torn charts of fishermen without charge.
There were moments when the past visited, not as fear but as faint echo. Once, a merchant spoke of a forgotten mutiny turned legend, of graves uncovered down south. The story was told carelessly, without weight, its facts wrong and its sorrow lost to entertainment. He felt no outrage. Perhaps that was history's proper fate. Truth diluted, until it could be borne without breaking those who remembered. The dead, after all, no longer needed justice. It was the living who required peace. Some evenings his students stayed late, laboring over geometric problems or trying to align the constellations. They argued amiably, spilled ink, laughed. He never silenced them. Their noise filled the room with a warmth his life had long lacked. When candlelight flickered over their bent heads, he thought of the future as a thing they already carried, invisible yet luminous. Once the others had gone, he often worked a little longer, refining the details of a map meant not for commerce, but posterity. A chart of the Portuguese coast, as he knew it from memory and feeling. Villages, cliffs, rivers, the familiar and the vanished together. He added notes in the margin, not unlike those secret annotations that had once haunted him, but now in plain, unguarded words. Here, he wrote beside one bay, the shape of the land teaches patience. Near another, the color of morning is enough compass. The lines of coasts became gentle metaphors rather than coordinates. In quieter hours he wrote letters, most never sent, to the bookseller's daughter. She still lived nearby, though age and health had confined her to shop and home. They exchanged greetings through her apprentices, small messages folded in book spines, requests for paper, remarks about weather. Words were fewer, but kind. Sometimes he imagined writing her the whole story, the map, the deaths, the secret he had buried twice. But he always stopped before ink met paper. Some knowledge serves best by remaining still. One gray afternoon, when mist rolled in from the river, he traced once more the unfinished coastline on his oldest map. For years he had called it incomplete, but now he added a final note beside the blank margin. Beyond here begins mercy. The words felt neither grand nor deliberate, simply right. Late in the season, his pupils gathered to mark a year's work. They brought bread, wine, and laughter. One of them presented a small gift, a miniature globe fashioned from wood, imperfect but lovingly carved. They urged him to inscribe a motto along its equator. He paused, then etched a phrase almost absent-mindedly. To draw is to remember. The boys nodded solemnly, though they did not yet understand. That night after they left, he placed the globe beside the compass. The workshop lay in half-dark, the lamplights dimming to golden smoke. He leaned back in his chair, listening to the faint rustle of the city settling into night. Somewhere below, a child's voice sang a slow lullaby, drifting upward through the open shutters. The tune reminded him of nothing specific, yet it carried the weight of centuries, the pulse of Lisbon itself, eternal, sorrowful, alive. As the flame sank lower, he folded his last sheet and pressed it under the weight of the compass. The trembling needle stilled at last. Outside, the moon rose, whitening the tiles of roofs and the sleeping river alike. He thought of Duarte's voice, saying that maps were ways of measuring faith, proof that men believed in order. Perhaps that was true, but he also knew that the spaces left empty had their own quiet virtue. They allowed wonder to breathe. When dawn arrived, Lisbon woke once more in color and clamor. The carpenters below hammered boards into place, and somewhere a church bell marked the hour. He stepped to the window, hands resting on the sill, watching the sunlight spill across roofs and laundry lines, each cloth trembling in the new breeze. He felt neither nostalgia nor ambition, only gratitude for the movement itself, the patient turning of days. In his workshop, dust glimmered in shafts of light like fragments of gold suspended in air. His unfinished map lay waiting on the table, pale and calm, its coastlines reaching gracefully toward blankness, the unending promise of things not yet drawn. Outside, the city continued its slow breathing, and the river, loyal to no master, carried that reflected light toward the sea. As he watched, the line between water and sky dissolved, merging into one silver horizon. In that moment, he understood that no map could contain all truth. The world, ever shifting, belonged to those willing to see without measure. With that thought, the cartographer smiled, a quiet, brief curve, almost invisible, and let the morning fill the room.